Hello and welcome back to the Mediocre Marketer. I'm your host, Whitney Cowell. Joining me today is Matthew Leffler. Matthew is the VP of Marketing and Sales at Contract Leasing Corp, but you may also know him as the Armchair Attorney. Welcome, Matthew.
Whitney, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here today and talk to you about this wonderful place we find ourselves in, the supply chain. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. So to get us started, I like to know people just in their worst moments to get us acquainted. So I would love to know, since you've been in the supply chain for quite some time, what is the biggest mistake that you've made in your career, and how has that shaped either what you're doing now or I guess what your plans are if it's something that happened recently?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it takes a lot of explanation. So I apologize in advance because this will take a moment.
We'll buckle
Um,
in.
yeah, so I'm a third generation guy in this industry. So my grandfather, after he finished in World War II as a tank commander, he became a motor carrier. He had 6 power units. He moved grain in central Illinois, and then he got polio and went bankrupt and lost it all. And my father became like a mechanic at the age of 8 or 9. And my dad eventually got to a place where he worked for, he graduated college and went to work for a company called Roadway back in 1976. And he was a night supervisor for Roadway. He spent 15 years there, and then he started his own company in 1991 doing maintenance and repair. And that's kind of where this story goes. My father had a great company, and he ran that until 2018. And I worked with my dad as a VP of business development and corporate counsel, general counsel. And we did a deal in 2018 where he exited the business. We sold the company. And that moment of selling the company, making the decision to sell, was both the worst thing that's ever happened in my personal career and also the greatest thing that's ever happened in my career.
Sure.
And it was a really difficult moment when we decided that the deal was going to happen, and we turned over the keys, and he left and he retired, and my relationship with him fundamentally changed. I had spent 6 years working with my hero and learning about this industry, and going into a new company and being in that position of the son of the founder of the organization. It was really tough, and it took a long time for me to reconcile with the decision we made. So that was probably the biggest, I would say, regret, but I wouldn't change it. Like, it's important that I did that. And then I left that company after a year and a half because I wasn't really excited. And then I had to deal with a non-competition agreement. So my background is eclectic, but that was by far the most defining moment in my career, is when we decided to sell that business back in 2018.
That's a huge moment to be personally involved with that kind of decision for a business. How do you think that shaped your experience and how you view the supply chain now?
So that's another fantastic question. So we were the largest vendor for a company called FedEx Ground. It used to be called RPS, Railway Package Systems, way before that. And we had over 100 mechanics, 40 service trucks, a fleet of like rental spotters. And I had customers that we had retained for 15 years, 20 years in some cases. And that was so interesting. And the way we approached supply chain on the maintenance side was every vehicle is always compliant at all times. Everything is safe. That is like the default. That is not how the supply chain operates. If you look at a thing called the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, they put out a thing called International Road Check. Many brokers, many motor carriers know about International Road Check. When that event happens, 72 hours, trucks and trailers are inspected. 1 in 5, 20%, are inspected, fail, do not meet the minimum threshold for safety operating on our highways. And that is the biggest difference that I noticed immediately.
That is wild.
Isn't that scary?
That
And
is such a big number.
It is. And it's not an aberration. Like, some people think, oh, maybe 1 year was bad. But if you look at the historical data, it is always like 1 in 5. And what are the things that are bad? BLTs, they're delicious sandwiches, but they're also brakes, lights, and tires. And those are the things that aren't safe. So we have to take a pause as an industry and go, okay, we want to make sure things are delivered on time, undamaged, and safe.
Sure.
But what is happening to the assets behind the scenes? And not a lot of people know that a significant portion is very unsafe.
Yeah. And as somebody who's worked with carriers, the overhead for that kind of maintenance is astronomical. And so I think we see carriers sometimes that are making their own business choices accordingly and find themselves in that situation.
Yeah, we call this deferred maintenance. I mean, when you're in transportation, it's a feast or famine. Like you're having a great time or you're having a really bad time. And
Yeah.
when you're in either time, you want to say, let's just not do the maintenance. Let's pause on that for now. Typically, maintenance is like your fourth or fifth largest expense for trucking companies.
Mm-hmm.
And if they pull back on maintenance, they save money temporarily, and then down the road, it's not nearly as good of an idea.
Right. So how would you say that knowing this information, your background experience, is that what drove you to create your podcast? Is that where you found yourself saying, we should be talking about this a little bit more than we are?
Actually, the answer is no. I wish that was the case. So my journey was really weird. So I graduated law school in 2010 from Michigan State University College of Law. I practiced law privately, doing trucking defense litigation. So trucking companies that are in accidents and things. And then I went in-house with my father's company. And then I went into software. And I went into software sales because I had a non-competition agreement. And the first software company I went to wasn't a great fit. So I went to another software company, and that software company had spent all their marketing budget for the year. And I was doing marketing and sales for them. So I said, well, I'll just make a podcast because that's probably really inexpensive. And that's what I did. So I was working with a company called VHub. It's an asset sharing platform like Repower or Coop. And I made a podcast, and I called it VHub Vignettes. And it was just short little videos interviewing friends of mine in the business. And we built an audience. I said, well, I could do this separately. So we started the podcast called Armchair Attorney. It's a trademark that I have. And I've eventually modified the name to Fleeting Conversations because I like puns. I really do like puns.
Sure. Yeah.
And I like talking to people. So that was like the genesis. And I absolutely love the medium. It's great to talk to people and learn about their backgrounds, what they care about, what they're passionate about, and then, dig into the nuances of how ridiculous this industry actually is.
Yeah. So you've been in the supply chain for quite some time. Longer than I think most in this generation. How have you avoided that? It's true, because
right.
Not only do we see people bouncing from job to job, it's a new trend, but a lot of times it's, industry to industry. How do you avoid being burnt out, especially when people like you that are intellectually curious, you start to see the underside of the industry that you're working in?
Yeah, the way I look at this is, everybody is at will, right? So we have a job, we're at will. We serve at the pleasure of the people who decide to pay us. And their loyalty to us is so insofar as you're able to achieve the goals that they have. For me, I've always looked at what I do as always the attorney mindset. So if I'm in a position, I'm working for a company and I disagree with something, and it's a profound disagreement, I have no problem pulling the plug and doing something different. And a lot of people over the years have kind of found that, like, you don't start at a company and retire there. I go back to my father's time at Roadway. If you go in the Wayback Machine, 1980, 60% of truck drivers were unionized. They were Teamsters.
Mm-hmm.
They had pensions. You could buy a house. You could buy a car. You could put your kid through school.
Right.
That's not the truth anymore. And what we find is the way that you get yourself further in your career is not by doing a great job for your existing company, but it's actually jumping jobs and getting pay bumps and getting title increases. And that mobility is what really helps people, get the next level of their career. You can still work for a company from cradle to grave and do amazing. But in this day and age, you have to be flexible. And we see the supply chain ebb and flow. And so there's industries that do well in certain times and there's industries that don't. And so being open and curious lets you be a little bit more mobile, I think.
Right. Is there anything that you wish you would have done earlier in your career to prepare yourself to where you're at now?
I think I would have been much better served doing more networking. So when I was with my father's company, and I loved doing that. Like I had I could go in my yard, I could see Old Dominion and Pitt, Ohio, and FedEx and UPS and Seva. I'm like, I have tens of thousands of pictures of damaged trailers in various like cell phones that I've had over the years. but I
Such an
didn't.
odd collection.
Oh, they're amazing.
I love
I
that.
so trailers are Whitney, I could talk about trailers forever.
I know.
They're so great. But what I didn't do is I didn't really utilize social media. So I just got into social media like LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever. Twitter was fairly recent. That was like 2022. But LinkedIn, I didn't start using until probably 2019, maybe 2019 is when I started actually like doing stuff in there. And that I think has been far more useful. There's a great line my friend Jamie Irvin says, which is your network is your net worth. And that's absolutely true. The networks that we build are one of the things we get to take with us everywhere we go. And if you're good to your network and you provide either useful content or insights or help, you can do a lot of really cool things with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if it makes you feel any better, I wasn't active on LinkedIn until really last year. Until I guess at the time this comes out, it'll be 2024. So 2022 is when I thought, maybe I should do something on here. And that's when I got started. So,
Absolutely.
I think your network is everything. I like going to the events, and that's something that I used to do when I lived in a different city. And then when I moved to where I'm at now, I just kind of let that fall to the wayside. And then COVID happened, so I had a great excuse to not go out and about and meet people. But the internet definitely provided another option that I just didn't care about. But I think to your point, it's such a great way to have a more holistic view of the industry. It's such a great way to challenge ourselves and our knowledge. I think if you're looking to not just change your career path, or if you're looking for the next steps, I think it helps you where you are right now, no matter what part of the industry you're in. Or if you're not, I mean, obviously outside of the supply chain as well, it can do that for you.
Yeah, and to build off of that, like the first content that I really started putting out in any meaningful sense had to do with a very esoteric legal concept called non-competition agreements. And I had been exposed to them because I had to deal with them. And I had so many people that I had encountered over my career that say, hey, can you just look at this document for me? Can you give me some thoughts about what this is? And I then used the platforms as ways I could advocate to educate people about these pernicious documents that are all over the place. And I found that those types of opportunities to educate and entertain people is just amazing. And I love getting into the weeds on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've been watching you for quite some time on LinkedIn, which is why I know you could talk about trailers for a long time. But I am curious how you turned sort of the idea of the podcast and take that into a true side hustle where you start building a following. So we could talk about marketing for just a little bit of this, and how that has not just shaped your career, but how it has shaped you personally as well, taking sort of that leap into that new territory.
Absolutely. So the podcast was really an extension of marketing my law firm. So for a period of time, my full-time job was the law firm that I own called Armchair Attorney. And I was using the podcast as a way to get out what I find interesting about whatever topic is out there. But the reality was the podcast gave a platform for guests to talk about what they're passionate about. And I found that was really this sweet spot where I could get someone who's a very senior level person, or like my very first podcast guest. I absolutely adore her, Judge Rosemary Aquilina. She's a sitting judge in Ingham County, which is in Michigan. And she oversaw the Larry Nassar trial. And we got to talk about like her experiences of being a sitting judge and having twins. Like she has twins as well. So it's just fun to get to know people. And I'll tell you this, and you'll probably learn this in your podcast journey. The best conversations happen 15 minutes before you start recording and 15 minutes after you're done recording, because that's where there's so much. Oh, there's so much stuff. You're like, oh, we can't talk about this on air. Oh, yes, but we'll talk about it off. And it's great. I love that.
Yes. And I think we dove into that too, talking about, our backgrounds and how they were built out. So I guess the next really big piece that kind of ties all of this together is something that you've done, I think, just flawlessly, which is making some of the more boring parts of great. Some of the parts that people think, oh no, like you just kind of maybe scroll by if you were to see it written out, how you make that sexy. The things that we should be paying attention to, like the numbers that we started this conversation with that really matter, how do we put that in front of people in a way that encourages others to start speaking up, to start paying attention, to start maybe acting differently?
I I try to be both educational and entertaining. I try to bridge
Yeah.
the gap between those two elements. And for me, it is so important that people understand the topics that are happening in the supply chain. So the maintenance is a good example of something that most people don't know. If I were to say to you, Whitney, I have 5 gallons of milk for sale, one of them is unsafe, and I'm not going to tell you which one it is. You're not going to buy the milk. You're not going
It's
to
a
do that.
bananas thing to do.
It is. And so we accept a level of mediocrity, I think, in this industry. And you're very good at what you do. So I'm not, I think you're not a mediocre marketer by any stretch of the
I
imagination.
appreciate that.
But I think I might be, to be perfectly honest. I'm not trained in this professionally. But what I am trained to do is persuade people. And so I'll take an example of a very specific case this year that many people kind of heard about and then kind of forgot about, which is the TQL misclassification of entry-level freight brokers. So you have this case this was filed in 2010, 13 years ago, and ultimately finds out that 4,500 freight brokers between 2008 and 2016 were classified as as exempt, meaning they did not get overtime pay.
Right.
These are men and women that work 60 hours a week for $30,000 to $36,000 a year,
Right.
that are expected to work weekends, that are doing all these other data entry things. And this will ultimately cost TQL anywhere from $100 million to $200 million. And in the deposition of Ken Oakes, who's the founder and CEO of TQL, they ask him, why did you do that? Like, why did you say they were exempt? Like, what was your thinking? And he said, I talked to TIA, and TIA told me to do that. And we as an industry go, what?
Right?
Why would you go? Did you not go to your lawyer that you have internally or externally? And we don't get outraged by this stuff, but let's just take that same thread. These people, these 4,500 people, in 6 months, 90% of them quit or get fired from TQL. And yet they have a 1-year non-competition agreement. So you have people in this industry who get put into this industry having their wages stolen and then being unable to find gainful employment after they're either let go or they're fired or they decide to quit. So these things are so important for us to understand, but there's not a lot of lawyers out there like screaming into the internet saying, you should get a lawyer. But my hope is to help people understand that you have power. There are things that are wrong with this business that can be made better. And that's the part that I get excited about, like whether it's, classifying independent contractors or employees or whatever. And FreightWaves has been a great example for me that allows me to come on their programs and talk about these topics. But yeah, this is the stuff that we should care about, but it's just not as interesting for some. But I hope to make it somewhat compelling.
Yeah, and I think you've done, just that, which is what I find absolutely fascinating about your own personal brand is that you've incorporated something that, I think it's rare. I think it's a rare type of personal brand. And it's absolutely fascinating. I learn more. Obviously, I have a strong tie to FreightWaves. Anybody that's watching this and doesn't know that was a place that I called home for a couple of years and really enjoyed my time there. So, that's understanding what is happening in the industry and from a broader perspective, understanding how that impacts other facets of the industry is incredibly important, regardless of what industry you sit in.
Absolutely. And, for my purposes, what I'd like to do, so my law firm is pretty much I don't take on new clients. Like it is a true side hustle. I keep it very limited, but I do answer questions on, Twitter or Reddit or, LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever, when people who are young in this industry have questions about practices they don't understand. You have to understand from the perspective of the employers. We need to make as much money out of you as possible. And sometimes they'll circumvent what the law requires because people who are coming on board don't understand it. And we don't, as a society, do a good job teaching people, like, how should you negotiate a non-solicitation agreement? But that's what I do. And so I find a lot of passion giving back to people pro bono or very limited, means to just help them understand these very, very challenging things. And again, if I'm on corporate counsel, I'm out there to trick you. Like my job is to make your life very difficult. And that's not necessarily what people understand. They want to get that cool mug and that cool hat. And then they get that non-competition agreement and like, oh, what do I do? Just sign it. We don't try to enforce. We leave you alone. Don't worry about it. Like, no, you
Right.
probably will do something with that.
Mm-hmm. And I think many of us have seen that happen. I know I have.
Oh, it's
So
pervasive. It's pervasive.
yeah, it is. So what would you say to somebody who maybe also has that same passion that you have to start speaking up, to start building a platform and share some of their knowledge, a young Matthew Leffler on the rise that's ready to start building their brand for themselves? What advice would you give them and how to get started, where to get started, who to start talking to?
Yeah, well, my advice is don't wait. Don't wait. Start. Just start. And you have no idea what your audience actually wants you to do. The only way you're ever going to know what your audience wants is to start putting something together. And as time goes on, you are able to build some value for people that want to learn about whatever it is topic you're passionate about. Stick to what you're passionate about. Don't do something that's not authentic. You had a great post a couple of weeks ago. Maybe it was last week, or I don't know. Time kind of gets weird when you have
Who
4
knows?
children. But like, there's the 3 things that I'm most passionate about for anyone who's in any industry is your authenticity, being brief, like brevity, and then being candid, having candor. So authenticity, brevity, and candor. If I can come to you as someone making content or trying to sell you on something or doing whatever I'm passionate about, authenticity will transcend the way that you do something. If you're not passionate about this, we can tell a long ways away. And when it comes to being brief, like if you can do something in 15 minutes, do it in 15. Don't do it in 2 hours. Like, be concise. And then the last part is like candor. If you don't think you can deliver something, like, you have to be candid about that. When I first started making podcasts and doing content, I named my podcast. The very first thing I named it was the Uncertainty Hour. Because I was uncertain if I was going to continually do this thing. I didn't know. So it was called the Uncertainty Hour because I may be consistent. I may not be. And it turned out that I wasn't particularly consistent.
I love that. And yeah, actually the 3 things that I listed for my motto and what I live by is being bold, being kind, and being intentional. And I think if you just move through life in that way, it's really hard to go wrong. And when I made that decision for myself, I didn't have my career in mind, but just like your 3 that matter to you, they impact every facet of your life. And a lot of times the things that we do that can be most impactful to our career, to our path, to what's next, is what we do in our personal time. And I think you and I have both seen that play out in our lives. And I'm sure anybody that's listening to this, that's given it a try, like you said, just, you don't wait. You just step up and see what happens, has probably experienced something very similar.
Absolutely. I found, like, when I was doing the podcast, so I think we've done over 40, maybe 50 episodes. I don't know. The most popular one I've ever done is just me reading The Raven. And that's it. Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven poem. And I'm like, okay, I can understand that. I chose it because it's a public domain thing, so no one's going to sue me.
Sure.
And I love Poe. So I was like, okay, you just experiment. You just try whatever you like.
I wouldn't have taken you as a Poe guy, but to each his own.
That's right. I have like the first 4 stanzas memorized, like just burn into my head. I had the first page of the Great Gatsby memorized. I don't know why. They stay in there and they just kind of worm around.
I was a Shakespeare person through and through, but I was also a theater kid. So, some things just stick with you.
I was a theater kid as well. I did Diary of Anne Frank. I was Peter Von Don, and I did 10 Little Indians, and I was the butler, Rogers. And Rogers didn't do it. I didn't kill anybody. I was also did track and football. There's a lot of stuff I did.
Yeah. No, I learned quickly I didn't like being on stage, so I made costumes and I did set design.
Oh my goodness.
But I also did like improvisational theater, and almost everything that I chose to memorize was Shakespeare. And I don't know why, as a middle schooler, that sat with me, but it did.
I still have one sonnet from Shakespeare memorized. I don't remember which one it is, but I think it goes, "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun." And it goes on from there, but we're not going to do poetry. That doesn't, I'm married. I don't have any mistresses. Let's be very clear about that.
Oh, yeah. Maybe season 2 we'll have a poetry hour with Matthew Leffler, and we'll share the things that we've kept with us in the backs of our brains for many years on
Absolutely.
camera.
That'd be fantastic. That'd be fantastic.
Well, is there anything else that you would give as a recommendation to somebody? Just because I am starting this podcast journey myself, so I'm always open to learning. I hope I'm never the smartest person in the rooms that I sit in. Maybe for somebody like myself who has started a personal brand but is looking to push that into a new direction.
Yeah, I think always do your research, right? Do as much research as you can. Being effective at communication really requires you to understand what it is you're talking about and understanding who are experts in the field. And I would say, like, to your own podcast, and I think this is advice I took myself, is be eclectic in the people you bring in. You don't know yet who your audience is. Now, you have great connections with freight and transportation, but you have no idea what you might be able to find on manufacturing or retail or strategy or just like military or finance. There's so many interesting things to pull. And that's the thing I think that is so necessary today, is that mind of curiosity, that learning mentality. And if you have the learning mentality, if you have that curiosity, there's nothing you can't do. If you do the research and you find the right people and you use the podcast as like whatever the goal is to create something that's meaningful and goes forward. One of the big things that kept me going with the podcast was I have no recordings of my father speaking at my age. Nothing. Like there's pictures occasionally, but there's no record of what he was like when he was 38. And I want my kids to be able to go back. Maybe they're never going to do that, but maybe they will, to go back and listen to who I was and what I was like in this moment in time. And even for myself, like I still think mentally I'm like maybe mid-20s. Like I'm definitely not. Like I wake up and go like, why am I sore? Did I work out? I'm like, no, it just hurts to be alive. And that's good to know.
No.
But I think that there's something really interesting on this pathway of memorializing moments in time and then taking those and learning from them. So I'm, you know what you're doing. You've got this thing going in a great direction. I think as time goes on, you're going to find that the earlier stuff you might not love, but it's going to teach you something that makes you better as you go.
Sure. And I think that that's great inspiration for anybody that is listening or that may stumble across this podcast at any point in time is, when it comes to a side hustle, I think what you're doing is you're building a legacy that you get to call your own. There's something so different, I think, in how you introduce yourself and how you view yourself, so far beyond your title, your industry that you work in, whatever company that you work at. It's the things that you have built for yourself that I think really make that impact both outwardly and inwardly. And that to me is so important at this stage in life. I feel like I just woke up in my 30s and was like, it's time. And I hope people do that before that point. Whenever you have that spark, I think it's important to follow through with that. Don't let that die out and try to rekindle it later. Nourish it while you have it.
That's right. And I would also, to build off of that, don't be discouraged if things don't go as well as you'd hope they'd go.
Yeah.
They're not going to go well. Like, generally speaking, everything falls apart. There is no like, you get to a place, you go, I've made it. Like you never make it. Don't get enamored with the data of like, this is how many engagements I got. This is how many. It's not about that. If you make it about that, then you're not going to enjoy it. It becomes fun when you can experiment. Like I have a TikTok. I am very bad at TikTok. And most of what my TikTok is things about my fish or my gecko. But the earlier TikTok content was poetry, and there's a lot of poetry, and it's just because I like that element of it. So you experiment. Like the stuff that I do on Twitter or X is manifestly different than what I do on everything else. So you just experiment in different places, and I don't know, it's fun. I enjoy it.
Yeah, I think that's the big takeaway for me, and hopefully for anybody else, is as long as you're having fun, as long as you know what your values are, and you keep persevering, right? Mm-hmm. I think that it's really hard to go wrong.
I couldn't agree more.
You pick up when it falls apart what you can, you put it back together, and if it's not for you, you put it back down and you move on to the next thing.
Absolutely. And the thing I add to that is there are stories in supply chain, for example, that will soon be gone. I mean, I mentioned briefly about like before deregulation, what it was like moving freight 50 years ago. Those stories will be forgotten in a couple more years. And these are the great moments to talk to people and understand, like, okay, what happens when you blow a tire in the mountains and it's 1965? What's the solution? Like, you don't have a cell phone, you don't have a phone to call. Like, what is a load board in 1970? It's a big block of things in a travel center that you say, I'll just call that number. It's just crazy to see where you can't know where you're going unless you know where you are. And you don't know where you are unless you know where you've been. And so this is an ongoing thing of learning all these different pieces that end up making a really interesting narrative of how in the world things go from across the world to our retail shelves or our doorsteps.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I appreciate the words of wisdom. And I think my dogs are getting anxious, so now is a good time to wrap it up. They've been bonking into my desk this entire time. So Matthew, thank you so much for sharing part of your journey, but more importantly, for sharing your wisdom and what you've gained along the way. It's been great having you on today.
My pleasure, Whitney. I look forward to listening to many podcasts that you put over the next couple of years. And if I can ever be a resource, you let me know, because I love doing this kind of stuff.
I appreciate it. And we'll probably talk to you in season 2.
Boom. Let's do it.
See ya.